Hello, and welcome back to the Election Tricycle. I'm Emily Tamkin in Washington, D.C., and I am joined as ever by Tom Hamilton in the UK
Hello.
and Rohan Venkat, who is in Cairo.
Hello.
Now, every week on this podcast, we take our little tricycle around the world looking at different elections, focusing on elections in the United States, India, and the United Kingdom. So this week is a huge week for us because we are going to unpack the UK election results. Now, first, don't want anybody to get too disappointed. India and the US will be in this episode in the premium section. Rohan and I will unpack some of the happenings in our countries. You can subscribe and become a premium listener either by going to my Substack, emilyctamkin.substack.com, it's ET right home, or by signing up at tricycle.hubwave.net. Before we get to the UK, France also had the second round of their elections this week, and the results were, I will just say happily, not what some people expected. So Rohan, can you, before we pepper Tom with questions, can you give us a bit of a rundown of what happened in France this weekend?
Yeah, being in Cairo makes me about equidistant between India and France, so I think I can happily speak to both of those places. Just as with India, where a certain thing was expected and something else happened, France gave us quite a surprise in the second round. We had spoken a couple of weeks ago about the first round and how the far right RN Le Pen's party got the most votes and seemed on track to get the most seats. But what ultimately happened is that enough of candidates who came in third place, cutting the votes of either the left group, which is called the New Popular Front, or the Macronist groups in the center, enough of their candidates decided not to try and cut votes from each other, that ultimately the result on Sunday was that the bloc that's in front is the NFP, the leftist grouping. And the bloc that came second is not the far-right National Rally, but the Macronists group, which most people had assumed would be down and out in this election, putting then Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella's far-right RN in the third spot there. Quite a surprise there. But the added wrinkle is that none of these groupings have enough numbers to get over the 293 seats you need to form the government. And so there's a lot of jostling still ahead and more things for us to dig into in future episodes. But ultimately, what the main takeaway from just the results is that what the French call a Republican front, speaking there of the parties that keep to the ethics of the Fifth Republic, broadly saying those who are willing to do what it takes to keep out the far right from power, that seemed to hold. Now the question is, within that Republican front, which includes this big leftist grouping and a centrist one under Macron that has no doubt been given a big defeat. They've lost their majority in parliament, but not to the extent that many expected. Now, who will govern? Who will be made prime minister? Which parties will agree to work with each other? All of this is up in the air and quite unclear at this moment what will actually happen. But that takes us to the UK, where things were not as surprising necessarily as these other two elections have been. Although there's plenty for us to dig into and expand on. Tom?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You're right that the overall result was not surprising, but there are actually loads of surprises sort of under the bonnet of the result. So. I've been saying since we started doing this podcast that if the polls are right, Labour will win a landslide victory, but who knows if the polls are right. Interestingly, the polls were right and wrong. So they were right in as much as Labour has won a landslide victory. They are the government. They've got a massive majority. We can talk about the implications of that as we go on. But they won with a much smaller share of the vote than any polls were suggesting. So Labour were consistently over 40% in the polls for basically since Liz Truss was Prime Minister. And although there was a slight drop in the last few days of polling, actually, so the polling did pick it up slightly. On the day, they got 33.7% of the vote, which for a party that's winning a landslide majority, which it did, it got 412 seats overall, an overall majority of, I don't know the number, but somewhere in the region of 170-ish. That is a tiny proportion of the vote. And the reason that happened is that the polls were broadly right about how the Tories did, which is extraordinarily badly. So the gap between the two parties was still enormous. And also there was a huge amount of tactical voting, which means that not only did Labour do very, very well, picking up seats in lots of parts of the country where it hasn't really had wins for a long, long time, but the Lib Dems did extremely well. Their best result for a very long time, 71 seats. So they picked up about 60 seats from pretty much exclusively from the Conservatives. So they're a big part of the reason why the Tories lost. And I think it's not particularly controversial to say, even among people who want to say that Labour did very badly, which on one reading they sort of did, although they won't mind because they won, that part of the reason for that was that many people felt that the best way to get rid of the Tories where they lived was to vote Lib Dem rather than Labour, and the Labour vote dropped off in some places where Labour won't have minded very much, and probably there was some movement in the opposite direction in some of the seats that Labour won as well, where the Lib Dem vote went down significantly. So yeah, Labour has been winning seats in all sorts of places that it wouldn't have expected. The most emblematic one, of course, was in Southwest Norfolk, which has never, ever, 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 ever been a target seat for anyone, actually. Always been a very, very safe Tory seat, held by Liz Truss with a massive majority at the last election, and indeed throughout her parliamentary career. And she lost to Labour by not very much, but by enough. And so the woman who was Prime Minister just 20 months ago is now not an MP at all. And I think most people would accept bears quite a significant responsibility for the fact that the Tories didn't win the election and the Labour did, at least that the result was as decisive as it was. So loads to unpack.
Yeah. Okay. Where to even begin? I have just a short question that I want to get out of the way, which is that my husband and I, like real freaks, watched Sky News via BritBox on election night so that we could see what you saw. And a bunch of people sort of tried to lay the blame for all of this, not only at the feet of Rishi Sunak, but in particular at his decision to call the election on July 4th. And it just kind of seems to me, please correct me if I'm wrong, like cope. Because while it's true that the economy might have been better in the fall, it's also true that you don't know what's going to happen over the summer. For example, if there's a huge wave of people trying to seek asylum or immigrate to the UK, that then reflects on Tories who are trying to position themselves as the anti-migrant party, and so on and so forth. So do you think in the aftermath too much weight was placed on the date?
Yeah, basically. I think it's cope in about three different ways. So one is,
let's hear them.
Look, they were massively behind the polls. As things stood, they were always going to lose badly. They did lose badly, but there's no particular reason to think that they would have won in November or even lost less badly. Secondly, the reasons why they called the election when they did were not crazy. There are two main ones that have been cited. One is that things were just not going to get any better in the time they had available. The boats were not going to stop in terms of the migrant boats coming over from France. There was one particular factor that reportedly the Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden was particularly concerned about, which was that every month more people were coming onto new mortgage deals, which were significantly worse than the ones that they were on before. And so you just had, tens or hundreds of thousands of people a month suddenly finding that they were significantly worse off, and that was only going to get worse because interest rates are always going to be higher than they were last time these people got their mortgages negotiated. So that's not a crazy consideration for them to have taken into account. And then thirdly, I think you have to disentangle two things. One is they made a decision to go for July, which I think is defensible. But secondly, they handled the start of the campaign in particular incredibly badly. You remember Rishi Sunak in the rain,
Who could
things going a bit
forget?
better, playing on the loudspeakers outside, a mess of an early part of the campaign, going home early from D-Day, all these things. Those were things that made the campaign really bad. They would not have happened in the same way if the election had been called at a different time. But I don't think that that's an indictment of the date. It's an indictment of poor management of the election as a whole. So I think it is mostly cope. The one other thing is we talked about Nigel Farage in previous weeks, who came back to lead reform. He and to say that he would stand, he actually did win he won a seat along with four other reform MPs. So there are five reform MPs, which is the most that there have ever been from them or their predecessor parties. Part of the complaint is if only they waited till autumn, Nigel Farage would have been stuck in America helping the Trump campaign. He wouldn't have come back. The reason he came back when he did was because he wasn't tied up yet. I think, to be honest, we live in a world now where, we can communicate with America now. We're doing it even on this podcast. It's not that hard for Nigel Farage to jump on a plane back to the UK. It's not that big a deal for him to say to Donald Trump or to his campaign in, I don't know, September, October, I know I said I was going to do an appearance with you, but now I'm not because I'm going back to stand in the UK. It's just not a big deal. Trump wouldn't have cared. So, I think that's hugely overstated. He did take advantage, but would he have taken advantage in November? I think he probably would.
Maybe we could look before we come back to reform, and I think there's a whole bunch of things there, but we'll see what we can tackle. But maybe we could look to the left. One of my big questions is how is Labour seeing this tiny, or not tiny, but this small vote share, or smaller one than they expected, and particularly given the Lib Dems doing much better than many expected, and also some independents doing well, the Greens getting a few seats, not big in numbers, but suggesting something else is going on. What is the sense of parties and ideas to the left of Labour?
So the Lib Dems are in a different category actually from those other parties. So the Lib Dems are historically the centre party. In recent history, have been in coalition with the Tories, which is still, I think, has been a bit of a natural problem for them in terms of attracting voters from the left. Position themselves really effectively as an anti-Tory party. All their attack went on the Tories. All their target seats were Tory seats, and those are the seats that they won. Labour will be absolutely, completely relaxed about the fact that they won lots of seats. That was a component of their victory, actually, and it's fine. There could well be some threats at the next election. There could be some Lib Dem Labour battlegrounds at the next election. Need to look at the numbers on that. That's not impossible, but for now, I think they're not particularly bothered about that. That was, part of the strategy was to let the Lib Dems do the heavy lifting in some Tory seats. I think the votes to the left are a slightly different category. So, in one sense, it is a direct product of the overall electoral strategy that Labour had, which is to appeal as much as possible to voters who voted Tory last time or couldn't vote Labour last time because of particular concerns about Jeremy Corbyn. And Brexit, actually, which is a slightly different category in terms of what made people vote Conservative in 2019. So they were able to get over the line in lots and lots of seats by being good enough and by being inoffensive and unscary to a lot of people that Jeremy Corbyn was scary to. And look, I don't want to make, I've got my opinions on that, but I think it is just that stipulate, it's a fact that some people were put off voting Labour by Jeremy Corbyn. That is a reason why a lot of those seats were lost. He attracted some people as well, and some of those people did vote against Labour this time, but they did it in numbers and in places that just didn't make a massive difference to the overall picture at this election, right? So Jeremy Corbyn held his seat in Islington North, which obviously has been a Labour seat forever, not a Labour seat now. And there were, I think, 4 or 5, I can't remember whether we're counting Jeremy Corbyn as one of the guys who are independent, 4 or 5 other candidates who won in all cases seats with a significant Muslim population. standing on a platform in which it was not, in all cases, it was not just a Gaza platform, but it was a platform that had a lot of Gaza in it, right? So that's partly about particular misstep that Keir Starmer made early on in that conflict, which I think we talked about at the time, and partly about a broader concern that Labour is, from their point of view, in the wrong place on Gaza. Although it should be said that Labour has immediately come in as a government and called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which has surprised some people who should have been paying more attention to what Labour was saying. But they're not going to get a ceasefire just from asking for it. That's not how these things work. But the government's position is fairly clear. In the short term, that's a trade-off that not that they would be happy with, but that they're prepared to wear, because they've won a hell of a lot more seats than they've lost, even though they've lost. So the most important ones in terms of important personnel, they lost the seat of Jonathan Ashworth in Leicester, who was a significant member of the Shadow Cabinet, has been in the Shadow Cabinet for a long time, was one of the main message carriers for Labour in the election, actually did a lot of broadcast media, would have been expected to play a significant role in the government, and obviously now won't, although he's just been given a job as the chief exec of the Labour think tank Labour Together, which is quite a good place for him to land. The other really significant one is one that Labour did hold on to. So Wes Streeting, who's now the health secretary, only held a seat in Ilford North. I think it's Ilford North. There's Ilford North and Ilford South, one of the Ilford seats. He only held a seat by 500 votes, despite going into that election with quite a big majority, again, to another independent candidate who was running on a similar platform to these others that we've spoken about. And that would have been a massive shock if he'd lost. It's almost as massive a shock that he only won by 500. And that's something that, because he's a really significant figure within the Labour Party, I think he will be a particularly influential voice in making sure that Labour doesn't lose sight of keeping that vote away, while politically, he's on the right of the Labour Party. He's in a fairly he's the most overtly Blairite of anyone in the cabinet. So while having always had a position on Gaza, which is not that far away actually from the Gaza independence, apart from being a bit more nuanced, a bit less anti-Israel, but no less pro-Palestinian, if you see what I mean, in terms of his overall positioning. So I think, and then the Greens, Gaza is a part of their platform, but less of a part of their platform. They won in seats that they won in 2 Labour seats. One Green seat, which has been a Labour seat within living memory. One Labour seat, which they were widely expected to win in Bristol, which is demographically completely on the list of the sorts of seats the Greens should be winning. And then they actually took 2 seats off the Tories in more rural areas, which is quite interesting, and that may or may not affect how they end up positioning themselves in the longer term. But actually, this comes back to a conversation that we had, I can't remember, a few weeks ago, about the fact that Reform had got so much more attention than some of the smaller left-wing parties had in the UK sort of general media discourse. And I think we'll see in the next few years how that comes to fruition, because we now do have parties to Labour's left that will take votes from Labour on the left,
right,
that will be challenging them rhetorically in Parliament from the left, and that will want to A, hold their seats, and B, potentially challenge in more. And how Labour responds to that is going to be really interesting, because they are threatened more directly by them. Reform are a bigger problem for the Tories, or they will be a problem for Labour. Whether Labour carries on with that sort of basic compromise position that it's said, we will lose some votes to our left, but overall we're doing enough to win big nationwide, which has been absolutely in pure results terms, that's been completely vindicated, whatever you might want to say about their policy positions.
Right. It seemed, it's funny, it seems sort of like there was as much discussion about how Labour might lose in the future as there was about Labour having won this election.
Yeah.
And I just quickly, I would like to get your thoughts on that. And then I do have another follow-up on the reform.
Yeah. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because on the face of it, it makes sense, because Labour, as I said, has won with a much smaller share of the vote than winning parties normally have. It's had, and a lot of people on the left have been very keen to point this out, it had a lower share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017 by quite a long way. And although a higher share of the vote, a smaller absolute number of votes than Jeremy Corbyn got even in 2019, although turnout was down quite significantly. So those are talking points, almost point scoring points. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing for people to say, but they've won big. But you basically say, look, if they can win on 33.7% of the vote, that's fine. But that doesn't feel like if it all swings back, then they have a lot of seats with very small majorities and they could lose them all quite easily. The question is, who do they lose them to and why do they lose them? And it doesn't go without saying that incumbent governments do worse. Quite often incumbent governments do better, but they only do better if they seem to be governing well by the people who voted for them last time, or the people who didn't vote for them last time but could be like, if part of the argument about Keir Starmer pre-election was people don't feel like they know enough about him, they don't know what he stands for, by the time of the next election, they'll know a lot about him and they'll know what he stands for. Will that be good for him or bad for him? Wait and see. But it's not impossible that they'll do better. There was an interesting line from, so I think Owen Jones, who's a commentator on the left, was saying that there's no way incumbent governments do worse. They lose vote share, they don't gain vote share. That's sort of conventional wisdom, but it's just not true. The Conservatives put on votes from 2005 as an opposition party into 2010. They then put on votes between 2010 and 2015. They put on votes between 2015 and 2017. They put on votes between 2017 and 2019. They just kept on going up in government. Now, that's not inevitable. I don't want to assume that Labour will do that, but it's also not impossible that they can do that. So the strategy for Labour now, I think, has to be, deliver, be a good government, and hope that people give you the credit for that, which is much, much easier said than done. But it doesn't just assume that this is the high point and it's all going to fall off a cliff from now on.
Right. So, okay, the other discursive thread that I was picking up on from over here is the Conservative Party debating whether the problem, whether in the future to save themselves, they need to try to get those Lib Dem votes back, or if they need to try to out right-wing the Reform Party. I sort of feel like one of these two, we have seen this, I've said this on this podcast before, we've seen this movie before. If you were a center-right party and you try to get far-right, hard-right, further-right votes, congratulations, you are now a far-right, hard-right party. Yeah. You will not beat them at their own game. You will either become that or alternatively eventually just lose to them anyway, as we've seen in the Netherlands. And also there are more, to me, it's so obvious. Okay, you lost more Lib Dem vote. There's 4 Reform seats, right? I'm not saying that Nigel Farage and podcast recurring character Lee Anderson aren't prominent figures in British politics, but there are more Lib Dem seats than there are Reform seats. Yeah. But it just seems like that siren song, right, of trying to hate immigrants more than this other, I shouldn't say that, of trying to fearmonger about immigrants or say that you'll be harder on immigrants more than these other newcomers. They just feel the pull. But what do you think, Tom?
I mean, so there's a lot of people in the Conservative Party who just agree with reform on quite a lot of stuff. Well, that's what it comes down to. And so they have, the debate about do you face left or do you face right, and can you cut off Nigel Farage by sounding more like him, or potentially even just letting him join the Conservative Party, not that he necessarily wants to do that. It's very, very tempting for them. But yeah, you're right. On the numbers, it's not, to get into government next time, they've got to beat a lot of Labour MPs. That's completely unavoidable. Mm-hmm. And part of the way that they do that, so it isn't just about the 5 Reform MPs, it's about the broader, there are loads of Labour seats where you can argue, although this is too simplistic, that the reason that the Tories lost was that Reform took a lot of their vote and then Labour came up through the middle. So if they can get a lot of those Reform votes back, then they can take a lot of those Labour seats, even if they don't win any votes off the Labour Party, which they would obviously hope to do as well. So the theory isn't just about taking those 5 seats off the Reform. It's about taking a lot of Labour seats through the Reform vote dropping off, which isn't completely implausible, except that those Reform votes are not all ex-Tories who just want the Tories to be more reformy. And there are loads of Tory voters and ex-Tory voters who really don't want the Tories to do that. A lot of people who voted Labour and Lib Dem, we shouldn't forget the ones who voted Labour, by the way. A lot of Tories who voted Labour and Lib Dem this time did it partly because they don't like the tendency of the Tories to sound like Reform on certain issues. You know, there are things that push people away. I think there's a broader issue as well about the Tory argument that says, were we too left-wing, were we too right-wing? They were neither. They were rubbish.
Right, nothing works. The problem is you've been in power for 14 years and you would need to build an entire separate London to solve the housing crisis of London.
Is it left-wing or right-wing to have not built any houses, let the NHS waiting lists get completely out of control, say you're going to control immigration but not do it, let other public services go downhill, and meanwhile see everyone's mortgage rates go up so that no one's got any disposable income? I would say that none of those are particularly left or right-wing positions, but they're positions that characterise the incompetence of government. And my big worry, were I a Tory strategist, would be, unless they can find a way of making voters think that they are going to be a better government than the Labour government that they now have, there isn't a route back for them in the short to medium term. Now, of course, that could happen. Like, Labour could be crap. And if Labour are sort of rubbish and seen as rubbish consistently over the next 4 or 5 years, and are beset by scandal and nothing that they try to do works, then there's absolutely a space that an opposition party could come in and win from. But it relies on Labour being rubbish and them being seen as less rubbish. And at the moment, they are seen as rubbish. That is the problem. Yeah. And it isn't that people think that they're too right-wing or left-wing.
Right. I do love that British optimism. Who can be less rubbish? I have one follow-up before I let Rohan have the last question word, which is, what did you make of Nigel Farage's promise that reform is now coming after Labour and coming for Labour votes?
I mean, it's what he's got to say. It's what he wants to do. It's not completely ludicrous.
Because there were a number of seats where it was Labour won, Reform 2.
Yeah, lots. And there are seats that Labour. There are a couple of seats that Reform won. I think of like Great Yarmouth on the East Coast is a seat that Labour had been targeting. I think probably expected to win and didn't win because Reform came in and took the seat instead. It was a Tory seat before, but it was a Labour target that they didn't get. There are definitely people who have voted Reform whose second choice would have been Labour, even if they voted Tory last time. There are some Tory voters who went to Reform. Some Labour voters who went to Reform. Look, for Farage to do well next time, he has to have there are more Labour voters now, so he has to have a message that resounds with Labour voters, and it's not impossible that he can do that. I think it's a similar sort of challenge, though, to the one that Labour faces in respect of the Tories, in respect of anyone, in respect of just trying to remain in government after the next election. So much of it is going to depend on delivery and whether, and this is really hard, actually. The classic analysis of the Boris Johnson voters who used to vote Labour, the Reform voters in general, wherever they voted in the past, the Donald Trump voters in the Rust Belt. It's the same sort of analysis of people who've been left behind by economic development, who don't see any prospect in the towns that they live, who've seen places get run down, and who haven't seen, the idea that Boris Johnson would level these places up was really resonant for them. The fact that he didn't do it is part of the problem and why they didn't vote for him again. A failure on the part of Labour to deliver is going to make both Reform and the Tories more attractive to these people.
It reminds me, sorry, I'm cutting Rohan off again, but it reminds me of something. My grandpa was a politician and judge, and he used to say that when you run for an election, like you give it all you have. And then once you're in government or once you're in power, pretend you're never running for an election again, right?
Yeah.
Like just try to serve the mandate of the people who put you there, do what you think is right, try to solve the problem. Because if you get cutesy and you're like, oh, how is Labor going to win 5 years from now, right? Like who are the voters we're trying to pick on and off? You're not like, this is what happened we just saw what that would happen when you do that, right? When
Yeah.
you're like, am I too woke? Am I not woke enough? Like just,
It's
run the
totally
country.
right. Yeah. Governing is running, and vice versa. And if you're not governing, then you haven't got that to do. So you've got to campaign. Right. But if you're governing, you govern, and it looks after itself almost.
Which is a hard sell in India, where there's elections happening all the time, and where the BJP has also really made a thing of being in campaign mode all the time. It's something that's been said about Modi, particularly in turning every bit of governance into a way of campaigning. I think I do have questions about Keir Starmer and the Labour government in power, but I think we'll have time to come to that in future episodes. We'll have plenty of time to examine that, and even to get you to stick your neck out about what Keir Starmer's reputation is going to be like in a year's time. But before we do that, one quick question again from the outside for those who don't understand the UK well. I think an Indian would not look at 121 seats and 20% of the vote for the Tories as being a wipeout, as being a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. It's certainly a big loss compared to where they were. It's a huge win for Labour. I was trying to understand, why was it being talked in about in such apocalyptic terms? Is it something to do with the fact that England then tends to have long periods of one-party rule? Is it just because it's the lowest number they've scored ever? What is the reason that,
I think that's a really good question, actually. And the one thing I'd say, actually, before I answer it, is that although they are talking about it in those terms, one of the really interesting factors in the run-up to the election was we had a lot of polls and sort of MRPs, so models of what the election was going to look like, that showed the Tories doing quite a lot worse than they did. So some models seeing them getting as few as 60 seats, which would have been, there was a possibility on some of those analyses that they could have been the third party to the Lib Dems, which obviously hasn't come close to happening in the end. So in one sense, they almost surprised people on the upside in the election if they've been taking some of these MLPs seriously. But I think it's the historical difference. So it is a substantially worse result than they've had, I think, ever. In 1997, they were wiped out and they didn't get back for 13 years, and they had quite a lot more seats than this. So you're right that in some other contexts, there are other countries where 20% of the vote, and let's say it's not far off 20% of the seats, actually, it's not a terrible result proportionally. That would be something to build from. But a lot of those other systems tend to have a larger number of parties that are vying for power, and therefore have to think about coalitions and alliances and so on, whereas Labour are governing outright for 4 or 5 years. So that's slightly different. One of the things that this election opens up, actually, and let's not get into this now, is the question of electoral reform, because people on the right who've never really minded about first past the post until now have suddenly noticed that Labour has won a massive majority on about a third of the vote, which on the face of it is not fair, right? I totally take the point, but these people weren't complaining when the Tories were winning, comfortable majorities on less than half the vote. But Nigel Farage, one of his big campaigning points now is going to be about electoral reform. And although I think it's unlikely in the next 5 years, I think there will be more of a groundswell of opinion from the right-wing media than there ever has been before in the UK.
All right. Well, on that ominous note, we're going to turn to Tricycle Recommends. I'm going to go first.
Yeah.
There is a piece in Politico called "Comment dit-on false hope en français." It's kind of it's a West Wing playbook piece, so it's just like a newsy little write up. But I thought it captured something quite succinctly, which is that there were people, sort of say, share my politics in the United States, who saw the French election and were like, this is wonderful, like saw the chance of no passaran, and we're like, oh, we can do this too, like not one vote for the right. The problem is we have a completely different system. This is not a parliamentary system. And also, we've talked about this before, the idea that I saw some who were like, this is what happens when you give people something to offer, when you actually offer something people to vote for, not just against. I think that's totally wrong, right? Like the French left did as well as it did because they were voting against the right. So I think while it was certainly nice to see, I don't know that there are any. I think there are lessons for the US to take, but I don't think that the parallels are as direct as some might like. So we will put that piece in the show notes. Rohan?
Yeah, and I think it's something we can tell listeners. We'll be coming back to this question of system envy. It always happens around results where people think some other system might be more useful for them, not always taking into context that voters think about these things and can be tactical as well as parties. But we'll come back to that. On my side, it's a piece in the Journal of Democracy by Milan Vaishnav. It's called The Rise of India's Second Republic. This is, again, broadly taking the approach that although the BJP and Modi have been chastened by the most recent Indian election result, they've made fundamental changes to India's democratic setup in the last 10 years that suggest a different kind of country that's not so easily reversed, even if they fall out of power at some point, including at the level of institutions, at the thinking about what India means as a democratic body and so on. It's a very useful piece that brings together a bunch of things that have been happening in the last 10 years and will matter regardless of the fortunes of the party specifically. Tom?
So I'm going to pick a really, really good Substack piece, which is the first and only piece so far on the new Substack of Chris Terrianescu, who's someone I don't know in real life but know from Twitter, which is about it touches on some of the themes we've touched on today, actually. It's called the Coalitionable Inoffensive Labour Party, and it's about thinking about how parties work to make themselves either parties that voters strongly polarize in favor of or against, or make themselves inoffensive and therefore appealing to a broader group of people who either vote for them or aren't particularly motivated to vote against them. And that Labour has got itself into this place now. And there's some really good comparative analysis with the Dutch Labour Party and other parties around the world that have taken on similar strategies of making themselves less offensive and therefore more electable, while their opponents have been more polarizing. A really, really good piece that we'll put in the show notes.
Before we go, do you want to stick your neck out and give us the Keir Starmer headline in a year's time?
Oh, I think it'll be something. So Keir Starmer headlines in a year's time will honestly, and I'm optimistic about them, and obviously I've got a background in the Labour Party, so I want him to do well, and I think he will. But in a year's time, I'm expecting to see headlines that talk about not enough has happened on NHS waiting lists or immigration or delivery of house building or the sorts of things that any serious, realistic commentary would not really have expected to happen within a year, but which you'll nevertheless get bashed for the fact that nothing has changed in a year. But in 5 years, it could be different.
Well, you don't need to wait a year, regular listeners, to hear more from us. Just come back next week. If you would like to become a premium subscriber, again, you can go to my Substack, emilyctamkin.substack.com, or tricycle.hubwave.net. We will talk to you next week. Premium subscribers, stick around. There is more for you right now.